So that's the yield of Intel's 10 nanometer. What's your minimum specification? A few of you have asked me to comment on the recent announcement for Rocket Lake, Intel's next generation desktop processor. I just didn't want to do just the normal, let's look at the specs and have a guess and have a think. I actually wanted to talk about what this means for Intel's strategy when it comes to the desktop space. Now we will start with actually looking at what is under the hood with Rocket Lake, Intel's next gen Core 11th gen processor. We've got this chip here is called New Cypress Cove Cores. It's an 8-core, 16-thread system with a double-digit IPC increase over Skylake. These Cypress Cove cores are actually the same Sunny Cove cores that we've seen in Ice Lake, but backported to 14 nanometer. So they've taken a 10 nanometer design and moved it to the 14 nanometer process. Very expensive. We'll get into that. New graphics architecture is UHD graphics featuring XE graphics, so that's the Tiger Lake graphics, also originally on 10 nanometer, now moving back to 14 nanometer. We believe this is 32 execution units here. A new memory controller, DDR4 3200, PCIe Gen 4, media encoders, AVX 512. So what we've got here with Rocket Lake is a chip that essentially is built mostly from 10 nanometer parts, but moved to 14 nanometer, which means they're going to get bigger. Adding AVX 512 is bigger. And as a result of that, we're getting the maximum limit of, as you can see here, 8 cores. Whereas the latest Comet Lake processors from Intel run at 10 cores. They're having to do a trade-off with die size and cost just to get it within something reasonable for the consumer land. So now that seems a bit crazy. This chip up to 125 watts. If we think about this chip, 8-core Coffee Lake was 174 square millimeters. And that obviously didn't have AVX 512. So we might be looking at something slightly bigger here because we're, porting it. But what I find interesting about this announcement is Intel has already announced Tiger Lake on 10 nanometer enhanced superfin. This is a quad-core product for mobile. But during that August timeframe, when we were being presented with Tiger Lake, we kind of already knew that we were going to have this 24 megavel through cache 8-core version coming out. We expect this to be something along the region of the standard Intel H series 45 watt parts, doubling the cores from Tiger Lake, going from 96 execution units on the graphics down to 32. But this is what Intel's going to target with the Tiger Lake platform. The question is, why aren't we getting this on desktop? Why is this 10 nanometer part with the latest Willow Cove cores and XE graphics on 10 nanometers going to mobile? And Intel has felt need to announce Rocket Lake as backported from 10 to 14 in order to go to the desktop market. Why can't we use this? Are yields on 10 nanometer that bad? So this is kind of what I wanted to look into. So I want to start by looking at octa-core dies, 8-core dies. This is the 14 nanometer octa-core die for Coffee Lake, 174 square millimeters. That's 8 CPU cores and 24 of these Gen 9 execution units. I'm going to put this into a die calculator to calculate how many wafers per die we get with an 8-core chip. So if this is standard die per wave calculator. I'm sure some of you have played with this. And if we look, we put in the dimensions, and then let's put in the defect density, which we know about. So TSMC's 7 nanometer process has a die defect rate of 9 per square centimeter. But all in all, we get 324 dies per wafer total. And then, with this defect density, we get a yield of about 85, 86% and 278 good dies. So these are good numbers to start. And if we look at, this is a slide from TSMC, this is where we're approaching 0.1 defects per square centimeter. And then TSMC's N7 and N5 is also trending in the same way. Just shows you how much of a lead up TSMC has. The question is, with this amount of processors per wafer, looking just either at 100% yield or a low defect density, how much is this silicon actually costing Intel? If 10 nanometer yields are so bad or the cost is so high, then how does that compare to 14 nanometer? That's the kind of game that we're going to play here. Let's go start with a theoretical wafer cost from Intel. Now, Intel's not a foundry. They don't sell wafers of chips to other people, so you kind of have to guess the cost, as it were. There are some numbers floating around, numbers specifically floating to say TSMC for a while about what that would cost, and that also buffers in TSMC's added return on their cost, right? Intel only sells to itself, so it doesn't have to make that much profit, so you could argue that wafer costs are lower. And I'm spitballing numbers here, but these are all with discussions with peers, keeping this in mind. So I'm actually going to call the equivalent Intel 14 nanometer wafer at about $6,000. These numbers are ultimately scaling factors in these equations, so you can move them up. But if we go down to $6,000 at 278 good wafers per die, we're looking at a silicon cost per CPU of $21.58 there or thereabouts. Now this is just the silicon cost. If we look into packaging, bundling, shipping, added R&D, it's probably double that. So it's probably nearer $43 per CPU. Now the most expensive product that this goes into is one of Intel's Core i9 processors. We could look at the Xeon W perhaps maybe as a bit higher, but going here with $524 list price for a CPU that costs, using our numbers, about $21.50 in silicon, or about $43 if you include all the packaging. Now the cheapest processor is actually these. This is the 9700F and the 9700T. These come in at $323. You may think, well, perhaps there are mobile chips that are cheaper, and for a start, it all depends on actually what silicon these chips are based on. I've specifically stuck here with just the 8-core processors, just to keep it simple. But yeah, we're going from $323 all the way up to $513, $540. So we're looking at what, about a 10x. If we go from the $21.50, $43 per CPU that it costs Intel up to here, we're talking anywhere from 8x to 12x jump up from that pure silicon cost. So what if we take the angle of, say, profit margin? If we use Intel's profit margins as a rough guide to how much money they're putting into the silicon, what do we get if we go through that number? Now, if we look at Intel's profit margins, they usually vary between 55 and 62%, depending exactly on what quarter and what year you're looking at. These are the latest numbers, and in the last 12 months, gross profit margin is 56.5%. Now, you've got to remember that there will be a number of products that get well above this. I mean, literally, if we were just saying 8 to 12x the cost, in silicon, and then perhaps half that, that'd be 500% profit margin, which is way beyond this. And then you'd have some products that get 10 or 20% profit margin, or actually are a loss leader in the market. So this number is pretty vague when applied to very specific products. So we're going to get some very large error bars here. But if we use this profit margin with that $323 lowest CPU value, then we get $140 it costs Intel to make the CPU, package it, bundle it, ship it, and then it go to retail, which compared to our $40 value, 2.5 times more. Well, sorry, 3.5 times more. So we are dealing with pretty wide error margins. And then again, if half of that is packaging and shipping, then you're looking at about $70 per CPU die. Now, if we go back and consider, well, how many good die are we getting per wafer? Again, if we use that TSMC defect rate, then we're looking at a wafer cost of about $20,000 here, as you can see, which is a bit different from the $6,000 I suggested. But yeah, we're dealing with large error bars here, just to give a sense of scale of where these numbers are. So, but that's for an 8-core die on 14 nanometer. We have to tackle this idea of, well, what level is 10 nanometer such that it also intercepts this, it's worth making it for desktop use. So if we look at the Tiger Lake die size, 4 cores, 96 execution units. This is what we published on Anantech earlier. Intel Tiger Lake, 144 square millimeters, built on Intel's 10 nanometer superfin process. This is 4 cores and 96 execution units. We expect the 8-core Tiger Lake to have 8 cores, 32 execution units, and then maybe moving the PCIe Gen 4 from 4 lanes up to 16 lanes. So there's going to be some movement around there, and die size is going to increase. Incidentally enough, if you look at some of the math and make some rough napkin numbers, it comes out to the same 174 millimeters we were looking at before, which is interesting. Which means we can plug the numbers back in. The die size is a little different. I mean, we're looking at 10.7 here millimeters in the Y direction, whereas previously it was something like 9.2. But we can plug these numbers into a cost per wafer. No, let's look at the increase in cost from 14 to 10 nanometer. And I want to take this. I want to take this slide. This was taken at Intel's Manufacturing Day 2018. I want to say it was 2019, maybe. These are the graphs we're looking at. It's actually the middle one we're interested in. Now, these graphs, for what they are, they're actually quite terrible. They're not actually saying much. All we can really tell from this middle graph is that the y-axis on the log scale for cost, it's a pretty bad graph, and it's only that tiny bit at the bottom compared to the whole rest of it. But we're looking at scaling from this 14 nanometer point up to this 10 nanometer point. What difference is there? Does it matter because we're in a log scale? Again, spitballing numbers, I'm going to say 10 nanometer in this case per wafer is 66% more cost than a 14 nanometer wafer, which instantly gets us to 10 grand. I wonder why I got that number. But yeah, it makes the math a bit easier anyway. So if we take $10,000 per wafer, and we estimate, just a standard die cost, because we had that such wide-ranging value from our 14 nanometers, anywhere from the $22 all the way up to $70. Let's start with a good $40 per silicon die, and standard 300 millimeter wafer, we get 250 good dies. That's what we're after. So if we plug the numbers in back into the die per wafer calculator, 174 square millimeters, but with the Tiger Lake dimensions, in order to get 250 good dies per wafer out of a maximum of 320, we're looking at a defect rate of 0.145 and a yield of about 78%. So this defect rate is about 50% higher than TSMC's 7 nanometer, and don't forget 7 nanometer and 10 nanometer are meant to be kind of like density equivalent here. So this is all very interesting. But our original analysis was, why isn't Tiger Lake's 8-core being used in a desktop, and why is Intel having to spend, is preparing to spend so much money, or has spent so much money, backporting both Sunny Cove and XE graphics to 14 nanometer? Does wafer cost and yield factor in so much that they're willing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to backport these architectures? It's a bit crazy. But the thing is, with $10,000 per wafer, we can plot the die cost in silicon per wafer based on the defect rate and yield, and this is kind of what I've done here. So silicon cost per CPU for 174 square millimeter die at 10 grand per wafer. We've got defect rate, which is related to yield, and then we can output a silicon cost per CPU here in the green. So as yield decreases, as defects rate increase and yield decreases, cost per chip increases, and that's just to break even on the wafer. Then obviously product cost will be double plus whatever on top of that. If we move this graph and take out some of the stupid defect rate numbers, if we eliminate yields below 20%, because I can pretty much gather that anything below 20% is not going to be viable. Even at this 25% yield, you're looking at a silicon cost per CPU of around $135, which is at least double what we've looked at before, what we've guessed before. And if we look at something like $96 per CPU, then we're going to need a yield of about 32% with a defect rate of 0.7. And that's where we are. And like I said before, these are all scaling numbers. So if we double the cost of the wafer, this axis has changed a bit. So yeah, then you're looking at you need much higher yields, to keep your costs down, to keep your cost per chip down. So if Intel's effective costs are 20 grand a wafer, this is kind of what you're looking at here. The point of all this is, Intel has decided to backport its 10 nanometer designs to 14 nanometer. That's not cheap. Intel keeps telling us that they're increasing capacity for 10 nanometer, and they're fully prepared to accelerate more 10 nanometer products into the pipeline. And we're just spitballing here a standard 8-core desktop chip, right? The yields are, whether it's, they can't hit the frequency, therefore, the yields, not even, say, 65 watt parts, right? At lower frequencies, they don't even want to do that on a desktop. If Intel can't justify the yields at this TDP for this 8-core like CPU, you have to wonder whether this 8-core Tiger Lake on mobile will actually happen at all. And if that's the case, then what really is the state of Intel's 10 nanometer superfin process? Was it Intel HP graphics is meant to be on this process as well? They're already demoing that in Intel's dev cloud, but not shipping that silicon to partners yet. You got to wonder if it's going to be ready or if anything's going to be viable. When we look at what Intel said in its financial calls with Bob Swan said in their Q3 call that by the time Q4 rolls along, they're going to have to start making bets on whether they're going to develop their 7 nanometer process. We've already heard that 7 nanometer is delayed. And the idea then is you have to spend millions and potentially billions of dollars to get the hardware needed to build 7 nanometer. So Intel has to decide whether they're going to make that investment, whether they have enough faith in their ability to produce a profit-making process node, because 10 nanometer clearly isn't profit-making still, enough to justify putting all those costs in, at the first half of next year, roll out their process, roll out their products, or whether they're going to have to look at TSMC. And I've been speaking with a few peers, and this kind of feels like a death knell for Intel's manufacturing, at least on the advanced nodes. I mean, if Intel decides not to pursue leading edge, do they still want to keep their 10 nanometer, their 14 nanometer, their 22 nanometer fabs going? If not, then they're going to sell them. Now, you might think, well, Intel's a leader in fab technology. Surely it would be worth a lot. Intel's fab worth is going to arguably be less than any other foundry out there, because Intel doesn't act as a foundry. They sell to themselves. So if they sell the fabs, if products move to TSMC and they suddenly become a major TSMC partner, for example, then whoever buys the fabs, okay, yes, you have value in the locations, in the equipment, maybe the personnel if they hadn't left already, and a lot of manufacturing patents out there, but no customers. And as anyone who's done mergers and acquisitions will tell you, a lot of value is in the customers, because customers determine what the profitability of a business will be over the next 5-10 years, and that's why you make acquisitions, unless you're actually acquiring it for IP. But then you could say the price is going to be lower there. So if Intel decides not to pursue its 7 nanometer designs, you've got to wonder, are they going to sell the fabs? If they are going to sell the fabs, who are they going to sell them to, and how much is that worth if they manage to sell them at all? If they don't manage to sell them, then is it going to be a financial write-down on the company, or are they just going to keep them up for 14 nanometer and 22 nanometer products? I mean, some of the stuff from Intel is on a 15-year lifecycle program. Some of the Atom processors that are embedded products are on 15-year lifecycle programs. So they have to put a plan in place, or at least produce enough chips, to keep those products going for 15 years. Or anybody who takes over the fabs and purchases the fabs might also have to gain those responsibilities. It's going to be a big time whether Intel invests in their 7 nanometer program or decide to sell the fabs or decide to do none of that. It's going to make big moves for Intel's financials come Q1, come Q2. It's going to drastically affect the direction of a lot of Intel's roadmaps. If they can't get fab space on TSMC for their leading edge products, does that mean that they get extended out for longer? It's hard to say. But truth be told, the fact that they've decided to go with a backported Rocket Lake on backport from Tiger and backport from Ice for Rocket Lake shows just how little confidence. Well, okay, little's probably not the right word. At the point where they made that bet, they had little confidence in their 10nm process. Maybe that's different. Maybe they're just going to roll out 8-core Tiger Lake, and they could have done a version for desktop, but they didn't want to because they were still assessing what it was possible with. Maybe I'm wrong on all of this. Maybe. Thank you guys for watching TechTechPotato. Don't forget to like and subscribe. You know, there's a potato here you can click on. Based on popular demand, I also now have a Patreon, patreon.com/TechTechPotato. If you feel you would like to contribute to this ranty content, then please go ahead. Much love for everyone who does that. And don't forget, what's your minimum specification?